pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Could everybody make sure that their phones are either turned off or on silent, please? So public forum first. For the students that are in the audience, who wants to present first? I'm totally kidding, I'm just giving her time. Nobody really gasped or anything, that was kind of the point, so. I know, it didn't work, I tried, okay. What's that? Okay, we're gonna move on to, what's that?
There's a lot going on here.
Okay. You good? Okay, I think you're right. Okay. All right, so we're gonna move on to the minutes of the regular meeting of August 23rd, 2023. Go ahead and have a seat. Thank you, sir. Could I have a motion, please? Thank you, Mrs. Kaiser, and a second by Mrs. Allen. Any questions, corrections? All in favor? Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay. We're gonna move on to financial reports. D, I would take a motion for 1 through 3 individual.
I'll do 1 through 3.
Thank you, Mrs. Fulton, a second. Any questions?
Yes, I had sent a question earlier regarding Mrs. Rosati, who was paid out of a federal grant. Do you have an answer for that?
Yeah, I talked to Mr. McDonald, and we're going to explore that. Right now, she receives a 1099 as a non, because she's a BOCES employee, not a Red Creek employee. We had a conversation this afternoon, and we're going to look at making a change to that.
She shouldn't be though. She should be paid out of a payroll code. And the district is also, should be paying payroll taxes on that as well.
That's what we discussed today.
Okay,
Any other questions?
thank you.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, thank you. All right, moving on. We're gonna take the consent agenda. I would take a motion, I'm not sure if we're looking for any exclusions. It's quite a list.
I have an exclusion.
Would you like to make the motion?
I would like to make the motion.
Okay.
1 through 50, except for number, it's coming, sorry, 39.
I was gonna say it must be closer to the end then if it's,
1 through 50, except for number 39.
is the motion for the entire
Consent agenda.
Or just the appointments?
Just, it is the entire consent agenda.
Okay. Okay. Can I have a second for that, please? Mrs. Foltz? Okay. So I would take any questions or comments on E1, E2, 1 through 50, with the exception of 39, and E3. Questions?
And
Probably not, but thank you for asking.
and E4.
I don't have a star next to that.
1 through 50 minus
It won't.
39.
Oh, because it's not, I'm sorry, and E4 too.
All of 3, all of 1.
So the only thing left off in E is E139. Everybody on the same page is? Okay. Questions on that group?
I just have more of a statement.
Okay.
I don't agree with Gloria having to start her probationary period at 0, knowing that she's been working in this role for a couple of years now, and that was an error on the district's end. So I just want it to be known that although I will approve, like I I want her to be in this position, so I'll approve that. I don't agree that she's starting back at her probationary period.
Can I just clarify that you're speaking of E1?
Yes.
Okay. E1,
E,
1?
no,
E2, 1?
One. Yeah.
I need to start with a 1, and then I wouldn't be so confused. Thank you, Elizabeth. Any other questions, comments, concerns, clarifications?
I have a question about E247. It was a question that got brought up on the agenda as far as why did we table the medical director till now? Or maybe I'm misunderstanding what
Are you-
the explanation was on that.
Are you on 47? I have that listed as Dakota Drake.
Mm-hmm.
If it's printed out, I think it got updated and we pulled the medical director off of
Okay.
actually getting voted on.
Okay.
So the board's not
That's
voting
in
on
new
her anymore.
business now?
It's in new business.
Right.
Okay.
Oh, we're not
taking
voting
no
for
one
her
else
here.
No, that's
Correct, yes.
Can I ask that you
Hold
no
that
longer have a
question.
question for this
I
section?
no longer have a question.
Okay,
for this
perfect.
section.
Any other questions? When you're ready.
Mrs. Decker,
Yes.
Mrs. Dingman,
Yes.
Mrs. Kaiser,
Yes.
Mrs. Allen,
Yes.
Mrs. Folds,
Yes.
Mrs. Madigan.
Yes. Thank you. Okay, can we go back and finish this last one? Can I have a motion for E2 number 39, please? Mrs. Decker, a second by Mrs. Kaiser. This is only in regards to E2 39. Any questions? When you're ready. Okay.
Mrs. Folds,
Yes.
Mrs. Allen,
Yes.
Mrs. Kaiser,
Yes.
Mrs. Dingman,
No.
Mrs. Decker,
Yes.
and Mrs. Madigan.
Yes. Thank you. Okay, moving on. We're gonna go to new business F1. I guess I'll take a motion to discuss the committees at hand for the Board of Education. Mrs. Kaiser? Can you raise your hand,
I can,
please?
but can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Why are all the students here? Do they
Uh,
want to present and not listen to us babble on?
I'll take a second for Mrs. Decker,
Second.
and they all want to be on a Board of Education committee someday. No, I'm just kidding. I tried to work it into that motion. If I had to guess, from speaking with Mr. Van Orman, that they are all participants in government and economics for their
Okay.
senior year.
Well, welcome, guys.
And they wanted to get it right out of the way.
Yes.
They didn't want an October meeting, they're like,
Yes.
let's go now.
I'm just fighting the bullet on this one. What's E247 and E239?
So, on the agenda, people that are appointed to certain positions are numbered. So if you look at the full agenda, which you don't have in front of you.
No, I just have my notebook.
Yeah, so we're just voting on appointments, but I appreciate you being engaged.
No, I just needed to write it down like that.
They're gonna be here at every meeting, it's so much fun.
They
Um,
It's good for class.
Heather, you're gonna have to carpool for people. Okay, so, discussion for the Board of Education committees, so we'll try not to make this super painful, but, if you look inside your, binder, Mrs. Ducker was nice enough to send along some information from NISBA, I believe earlier today, correct? It gives you a little bit of information, that's gonna be helpful for this discussion, so thank you, Mrs. Decker, for doing that.
And then you'll see the emails as well.
Yep, and then Mr. Van Orman and Ms. Osborne were nice enough to copy off anyone who sent back descriptions for the committees that they participated in or have been forced into, descriptions for those. So we're gonna kind of look at those overall really quick, and then I'm gonna give you some information that I got today. So let me just find my list here. If you take the board committee's guide, which is gonna be the one that has the fun front page, flip it over to the middle section that's gonna have the committee duty and members. So, this was just a few hours ago, I mean, it hasn't been very long, so if you haven't had a chance to look at it, it's not a big deal. We've been kind of the committee selection and understanding of what's going to happen, direction for these committees has been a little messy, and I think tonight would be a good night to kind of clean that up a little bit. So this kind of points out what per regulation committees are necessary for within the school district. The only one that necessarily applies to us that's mandatory is going to be the audit committee, which is the fourth item down, which if you refer back to our list, every board member is a part of that. So anything else is extra for us. So this is something to keep in mind. Mr. Van Orman and I have gone over this list, and fortunately we have either groups or committees or teams that already exist inside the district that cover these categories. They can be covered by more than one. So for example, our district safety group could do visitation committee. They could also do health and safety. They could do the safety team. So it doesn't necessarily have to be one-to-one for each committee. So while you're keeping that in mind, there's also the other section that says the board committee charter, which if you kind of skip towards the back, you're gonna see the part that's got the blanks in it. And it's actually a pretty good template, I think. So again, Elizabeth, I can't thank you enough because this definitely prompted some help for me today. With our groups, when you're looking at the list for the committees, the audit one is on the bottom. My suggestion right now after talking to NISBA is that we do a little bit of cleanup, and I say that because not everything is necessary on here. Not saying that we need to get rid of anything or change anything, but they were very clear with me today on the phone that your committee should have a purpose and a goal, or they really shouldn't exist. Or when they have a goal or a purpose, then they would be reinstated. So, for example, if we, I'm trying to think of something good off the top of my head. If we decided that, well, I'll use the one that we're working on, community relations. So we all felt that community relations would be a good opportunity for board involvement with students, staff, district members. You can have that. I mean, we might have some missing pages from Stephanie, so if you did it on purpose, no big deal. Here, look at that one.
I found it.
Sorry, I retract my earlier statement. You're right over there. So if we were to decide, and I think we have decided that we would like to see some sort of community relations committee be formed, our role would be to charge the superintendent to put together this committee, and then we would invite board members to be a part of it because we would be able to play an active role. We would set the goal for that committee and the time frame. So if it's a whole year idea, we would say it starts, September 1 and it ends June 30th. We would put out there that maybe one of our goals is to develop a booster club. So we would assume that Mr. Welcher would also be a part of that team. Mrs. Decker's giving me a weird eye.
I'm looking at Mr. Welcher.
Oh, that. By the way, that was just hypothetical. So if that was the goal, the time frame would be out there. We would obviously have board members to be a part of that team under the supervision of the superintendent. We would come back, we would meet as a group, we would be able to find some timelines, see some progress, and obviously, hopefully, accomplish the goal in whatever time frame we're looking for. On the other side of that, though, I think we've had a lot of committees here on this list for a long time that don't necessarily really need to be there. And I know we cleaned up a few of them. And I'm not suggesting that anything is deleted tonight, but I think that we should consider it maybe for next year. For example, if we take the community center board, I don't want to speak to the community center bylaws because I know that they're separate and there might be a condition in there stating that there needs to be a Board of Education member on them. I think there might have been at least at one time. That committee was formed far before there was the overlap of the athletic director and the community center director. Well, those two positions report back to the board on a monthly basis. So is it redundant to have a board member also attend that? Maybe it's not. But if it isn't, and we want to keep that, then we need to fill out one of these charter pieces and we need to explain the reasoning behind it, what we expect to get from it, and the time frame that we expect to meet that goal. I had explained to our NISBA rep kind of what we had going on as far as our committees, and her suggestion was, if we took finance and budget, if we don't have a particular goal for the finance and budget committee, we're already into the year. We don't need to dissolve that right now, but we would basically leave it to the discretion of the superintendent if we needed to be involved with something within the school district. If we don't, then that committee kind of sits there. Again, we've talked about personal goals of maybe some of us that are a little bit heavier in finance background, helping to explain the budget process and things that maybe need some clarification. But that doesn't necessarily have to be a committee. That could be just something that board members work on independently. Questions so far? I'm talking a lot, but I'm pretty much done. Okay.
Actually, so are you saying that, that there's a chance that we might not finalize things right now because we're into the school year already? It might just make sense to make it a goal to accomplish for next school year?
No, I think that we should finalize them. I think that it's apparently the role of the board president to fill out the charter from the direction of the rest of the board, which I can do for each of these committees. But I would say for the committees, for example, like finance and budget, that don't necessarily have something going on right now that would involve the need for a committee, that we don't necessarily fill out a charter for them right now. And we look at them, they sit there. If there's an opportunity for those board members to be used in something to do with, you know, Mr. Van Orman's goals for this year, maybe after we do our board goals, if something arises, that committee can come back together. But maybe it needs either to be dissolved for next year if there isn't some sort of goal, or the goal needs to be established. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So they wouldn't get a charter, but they would still sit on our, that's my suggestion, on our committee list for right now.
So I would just say, my concern would be that if we eliminate committees that we might not be using in that moment, and then mid-year, we have something come up where Mr. Van Orman might say, I really wish that, like, we really could use a finance committee right now to discuss things. My concern would be that if we're eliminating some of those roles, I know that we can add ad hoc ones back in if we needed to, but I just would be concerned that it might get messy.
So I had the
going
same
in and out
question.
at the same time.
And she, our rep there had a very different view, I guess, than I've had formally or in the past on these committees. And she, you know, when I first joined the board, it was, you got put on a committee, especially if you were a new person, you probably got a not so fun committee. And you got put on that committee and you kind of learned what it was about. You might meet, you might not meet, but that you were just on that committee, no matter how much it involved. And she was explaining to me that that's not necessarily what should happen. The committee should be formed because they have a purpose. If they end up mid-year needing that purpose, that we should form the committee because now we have a goal for that committee. Doesn't mean that we have to do it that way. And maybe what we should do is some of the committees that don't right now have a clear direction or goal for this year, let's see if it comes up. Let's see how often we necessarily need a finance and a budget person. I'm just staring at you a little bit in case that ends up being you. But
I'm just wondering, so you don't think that we need to have?
we can have the committees as long as we have a goal for the committee. So like, you know how we had discussed doing like the budget for dummies type thing for maybe like new board members or people or any member that needed some clarification on the budget, and others are better about that. We need to fill out this charter and we need to say that's the purpose of the finance and budget committee. If there's no purpose, then there's not really a point of having a committee. This is the way it was explained to me today. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we can have goals for whatever committee we want. But I think when we originally were explaining the descriptions or trying to come up with descriptions, it was a little bit more about how to keep a committee going. You know, Stephanie Folds is the BOCES rep. What about being the BOCES rep? Well, it's because she's the BOCES rep. And that was kind of the end of the explanation, because at this point, her role hasn't really started yet. Well, maybe we still want to keep that because her role is to be the rep when necessary for a meeting twice a year. Doesn't mean that we have to eliminate it, but we do need to establish the reasoning of having these committees.
I would say it would probably be better to keep them because maybe we don't need the BOCES rep all year, but maybe something comes up and then we would have to hold like an emergency meeting to designate somebody to be the rep
Yeah.
to go do that. And I think that would,
And I
it just
think
Yeah.
seems like
what
just a
you're
sign of people.
suggesting to- right, I mean, really, that's what
Yeah.
you're suggesting for this year, is
Yeah.
that we might not have a charter, but if something comes up this year, BOCES related, that would be
Well,
understood that I would be the rep. helping
And
that.
we could, if you wanted to, we could write the charter for that group, and the description and the goal could basically be at the need or ask of the superintendent.
Mhm.
So,
To me, the charter seems like it's going to be an easier process for us because as we were each coming up with our own definitions, at least my perception coming into this meeting was, well, shoot, we're gonna have to talk about what I wrote for a definition to see
Yeah.
if it's agreeable to the rest. But if we have a template and like a boilerplate that to just fill out for everything, it might just make the process a lot smoother.
yeah.
At least that's what I'm thinking.
I mean, I think that's a good way to go. I mean, I'm happy to hear other ideas. And to be honest, I think most of them, if we were to use, you know, I'll use rural schools, I'm the rep for that. You know, if the goal is simply to be the rep when necessary at meetings that are mandatory, that could be the goal for this year. I could do, I think, write up the charters, have them sent off for the rest of the board to glance at, make sure that they're okay. You don't see any errors or any changes that need to be made, with the exception of the policy committee, which I'd like to discuss a little bit further. But I'm just wondering if for this year, instead of going through of saying, okay, here's everybody's descriptions, let's try to, you know, write a formal thing. I think this charter thing is a great idea. I'm very glad that Elizabeth found it because I think it could be really helpful to us, and it's gonna be the same template for every committee. So, you know, my personal opinion, I'd like to move forward with the community relations committee. We've talked about it in the past. This also gives the opportunity for the superintendent to come back with ideas of how to make a committee work. And we, you know, we could set the goal for that.
Okay, so I'm gonna be honest, I sent this out, while I was at work and I didn't really have a chance to look through it
Oh.
super thoroughly.
It's great.
Okay, so if we fill out these charters, does that just make us a committee and then as we have goals that arise, are you saying that we make the goals as they come up?
Yeah,
Or
so
we're
if
not
there's,
actually making goals, we're just
well, so,
chartering the committees?
well, so not all of them. Some of them already have goals. So for example, it would be very easy to enter in the community center board rep because the goal is to attend the monthly meetings and bring back information to the board when necessary.
But some of
No.
the other ones might not have goals right now, they might just have a charter making them a committee.
And it would be like kind of a
Inactive.
TBD when needed type thing.
Okay.
Did we already have, I'm just quickly looking through this, to see, do we already have a description for the community relations?
We did not, we spoke about that as a group, and because it's such a big topic
Yeah.
with, when I started going through some of the notes that I had from just comments that were made, I thought maybe it might be a little bit better for Mr. Van Orman to kind of come up with a plan of how to form a committee, and then whatever board member or board members ended up on that committee, they could kind of help form the plan on how to keep that group moving.
Okay, so we'll see a charter come through for that, and then we'll have discussion on what that looks like and whether it looks good and who's gonna be on that committee.
Well, so I would do all of the charters.
Yep.
And then you could look at all of them, and then I would say the goal for the community relations would be very broad. And then after that team was made up of admin, teachers, board members, parents, whoever it was, maybe we might be able to go back and fine tune that goal a little bit, if that works. Okay, I'm gonna believe that
So
works.
we're kind of tabling it for now and you're gonna give us more stuff.
Yeah, well, so
We'll
there's
go
nothing,
over it.
it's not actually, it's not actually a, something that we vote on, it's just basically like agreed to. So once the charters, you guys glance at, it's not very much to fill out. If you looked at the form, it's, you know, like 8 or 10 blanks. You'll look at it, we'll all have a copy with it, and we'll basically keep those goal sheets along with the committee board, or the board committee list. and then it'll be there to refer to. So maybe in 6 months from now, we can say, hey, geez, we expected the community center board rep to do X, Y, and Z. We're, 6 months in and we still haven't done that. We need to kind of regroup and make sure that that's happening. Sound all right? Okay. Only exception to that is gonna be the policy committee. So the policy committee is Mrs. Allen as the chair, Mrs. Dingman, and Mrs. Decker. So, after reading the descriptions, on the policy committee, I think that we need a little bit of clarification before I could potentially write a charter for that specific one. And I say that because I think that we need to come up with what the will of the board is moving forward.
I never got
We
that,
didn't receive that.
the goals.
No, it was just Kim sent a description of the policy.
maybe only
You
to
said it to send it to everybody, though. We didn't get that.
Were you
Kim.
not, did you not? Maybe I
So-
didn't even recognize that. I'm
No,
sorry.
No, and I thought
Yeah,
it was
but in
only
your
going back
emails.
to you and that you were collating everything and sending it out to everybody.
I'm sorry. Everybody else copied everyone, so I probably didn't even recognize
I
it.
only
So,
got them from Stephanie,
Okay.
Rhodes, and Nancy. I haven't
Right.
got
that's
You'll
completely my
see
fault.
all the responses are compiled in the email, stapled email packet.
So,
Policy committee.
yeah, so
These were all the,
Kim's is the second
Oh,
page.
yeah.
If you wanna just
Sorry.
glance at that for a second and then we can discuss it.
I wrote a lot more.
And I acknowledge that I wrote a lot less. The disclaimer to that though is that I did get some information from NISBA too, so I feel like we have to wrap our arms around like a ton of, this is just loose.
Okay. What is this?
Yeah. Are we supposed to comment on this? There was only two bullets.
Just the policy committee. So if you just glance on the policy committee, you're welcome to take these home and reread them later if you want. You can make extra copies if anybody needs something to read before you go to sleep.
So if I'm understanding, we're gonna make goals for the policy committee, and we're gonna make goals for the community center? No,
Community relations, we'll have a goal
Okay.
for that.
but not the community center person that's supposed to go to meetings?
So it would be to attend the meetings. So every charter needs a goal or the lack thereof when needed goal. But so the policy committee, when you're reading through this, I think that, and feel free to jump in as soon as I finish this, the policy committee needs a little bit of direction on what the will of the board is. So there's a couple of options here. Again, if I misspeak, please correct me if you've spoken to NISBA about it. But we have some policies coming up in the next few items on the agenda. Is the policy committee simply reviewing for Erie 1 suggestions, attorney suggestions, moving those forward to the board? Are we asking the policy committee to do a full policy review, which is quite an undertaking? Are we asking for the policies to be individually reviewed for their need or importance, if they should be part of the policy book anymore? So I think if that's okay, that's maybe where you were going.
Even just to go back to foundational things, we don't have a policy on policy, so even backpedaling and saying, do we want that? Do we want to start there? And then is it the will of the board? Or what is the will of the board of how the policy committee progresses and moves forward?
Okay.
So I think even starting there.
Okay, so a policy on how to, okay. Is that a mandate?
No.
Okay. So let's start with that. The thought process is, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, that it could be easier to, how am I gonna say this? It would have more clear direction if there was a policy made from this board on how to handle policies. Is that correct?
That's a great way to put it.
Okay. I'm not totally sure I know exactly what I just said, but can I have some feedback on that? Your thoughts, especially policy committee, as I know that this has obviously been a topic of conversation. You're only on my
What does
right
that,
other than
what,
Kim.
what does that policy look like?
That's a fantastic question. I have absolutely no idea.
I'd be curious if Erie One or NISBA had a sample policy.
They do.
They do.
Oh, do we have it?
Yep, I did forward to the three of you on that end. I don't know, I had to go back and look at my sent items, but that was the stuff I had received from NISBA, forwarded it to you. I said, okay, there's a lot of information here to dissect. Obviously, it'll morph into the conversation that we have as a whole with the rest of the board. So she had included, the NISBA rep had included a sample policy. However, that was from NISBA, not Erie One, and I think we wanted to hold it side by side with Erie One to see if they were similar or if they were dissimilar, what we wanted to do.
Okay. I guess I would say for me, and I usually wait until the end, but I would say because there was, I would say a lack of attention to the policy committee last year. I personally would like to see the policy committee strictly deal with reviews, changes, adaptations that need to be made as a result from Erie One or attorney direction
So
to start.
I would just say, if that's what we're gonna do, it would almost, like it would almost just be more worthwhile to eliminate the policy committee altogether, because then we're just looking at recommendations that are coming from BOCES and voting on whether or not to approve them. Generally, if we are making adjustments to policies that we already have, or if we're getting policies from BOCES, it's because they're mandated, they're recommended, or the changes themselves are wording changes that are either mandated or recommended. Oftentimes, we're probably not going to be, as the policy committee, we're not gonna say no to most of them, and then we're just looking them over. If we're not looking at them in a way that we're trying to make them fit our district better, I don't see a point in the policy committee meeting just to say, yep, that looks good from Erie, yep, that looks good from Erie, and not make them fit our school's needs, if those words make sense.
So Mrs. Ecker, you're not saying though that you would eliminate a committee, right? Since you just got done telling me you would not eliminate committees.
No, I'm saying I wouldn't see much of a purpose in the policy committee meeting if all we're doing is looking at the change. If all we're doing is looking at changes that are recommended from Erie One, I feel like the rest of the board has to look at them at some point anyways, so we should just do that as the whole board, I guess is what I would say.
So don't misunderstand me, it's not necessarily that I think that it needs to be the only charge to the policy committee. I just think that there are quite a few things that possibly got overlooked or not dealt with from the year before that maybe need to be updated in a quicker fashion, if I.
Right,
that's a
so there
better-
are certain policies that you have seen in the past few months that are, yes, and I'll use the term rubber stamped, yeah, move it along. And there are other policies that we can craft
Correct,
that
so I
are
guess,
more for,
But if-
you still have to comply with the law, however,
so I guess my suggestion or my thought would be, if we're, as the policy committee, I would say, we do red for the changes. I don't know if we say red for the Erie One recommended changes. This is how the policy committee would like to adapt it to the district, and then present it to everybody for board feedback. Then we're not writing it. Everyone can see what Erie One is suggesting that we write, and everyone on the board can decide together if they feel that our adaptation is appropriate.
So I'm not,
that's what, but you said to get rid of the policy committee where.
No, I said if all we're doing is rubber stamping, basically.
like if
And
there was
approving.
never any,
Right,
But
if
there
we're
are
not,
changes, like, you just haven't been, like, we haven't dealt with those policies yet where there are changes.
But I'm saying we either give the policy committee the ability to make those changes, or else the policy committee is just rubber stamping and there's no point if we're not allowed to make those changes of having a committee.
Well, so I think what you mean though by make those changes is make a suggestion, when it comes back. I think, I'm thinking that we're saying the same thing, but maybe in different words. So I don't know how this end of the table feels. I don't have an issue with that at all. My only thought process is that I'm assuming there is quite a stack, only because I know I didn't approve any policies last year. And that there are some things that we need to have updated and we need to get through. And so I would agree that if there were those ideas or those policies that could potentially be changed for this district to help fit our district better, maybe that comes through on the first reading. So then there's a possibility for the rest of the board to see, and hopefully the idea is that when it comes back for a second reading that we're closer to a vote of passing those.
So you're saying when the policy committee presents the first reading to the board, we're giving the changes that we recommend as the policy committee, or that we have reviewed and feel are appropriate, and then we talk about it at the first reading, and then the policy committee goes back and makes adjustments accordingly.
I think if they're necessary, but I think there has to be, I think it's difficult because I think there has to be some parameters around what your suggestions may be. And I'm gonna use a really ridiculous reason, but you know, if the changes are high school policy that you would like to see changed because you have a high school student and you think it would be a better fit, that's not necessarily something that I think that the policy committee should be deliberating on. If it's because the policy names the number of exits in the building and it's wrong, well then I would say, of course, why wouldn't we make that change? I mean, maybe year one doesn't have the right information. So I don't know if there's a threshold to understand what needs further discussion or what needs to be adapted to the district and what doesn't. I haven't been on the policy committee in a really long time, so I don't know what your process is in reviewing them, if that makes sense.
So I think at this point, we need to figure out we need to come up with a process. We need to fill out the charter so that we have a boilerplate of what we're doing, right? But then also, the third piece of that is what does this board want the policy committee to function as? Like what, as a whole, what do we want that to look like?
Can I have some other input other than Elizabeth and myself?
I think, yes, I think we need to discuss as a board exactly that in terms of what this committee is able to recommend, what their role is in the review of the policy. I think that does need to be a fuller board discussion. And I agree, it's almost like an audit in terms of making sure that, you know, the oversight on the committee is looking at the whole district and making decisions. So I would agree in terms of, I think there's a purpose behind the policy committee, but I do think that we need, especially as a new board member, I mean, I'll just say, I have very little background in terms of what's happened previously. I think it would be good for the entire whole to have that discussion, especially if there's backlog policy.
So my understanding is we're actually caught up with what we were last week close at the last meeting.
Then I investigated it. We are not. Sorry,
Well, that was a good couple weeks.
it was.
I'll go with the will of the board.
Okay.
I think we need very clear expectations and goals for every policy, every single one of them. I think some of us have personal ties to some committees, and I think that if, as a board, we can come up with goals for all of them, not just the policy committee, I think that would be helpful for everyone.
Nancy? Thoughts?
I think Stephanie just said it perfectly. I do.
All right. So I guess we need to come to a consensus on how the policy committee will move forward from this point at least. Obviously, these charters aren't, written in stone. We can make adjustments.
Prioritize the
Yeah.
backlog, I think.
So that's a good point. Could the initial goal to be prioritizing the backlog of policies that are waiting for updates, bring those forward, and maybe what we should do is, at the next, I don't know what the schedule is for the policy committee meeting, but, and I don't know what the backlog looks like. Is it humongous or?
No, it's not insurmountable.
Okay, so I mean, I guess I would say, when going through those, for, the Erie one updates, maybe there should be, a little bit of a conversation about what of those policies could potentially be, massaged for Red Creek Central School District, and then bring that information back, because if it's all of them, well, then we need to have a different discussion. If it's none of them, then that's also a different discussion to move forward.
Yeah, I think that's what we were doing with the original backlog, that we thought we were caught up on. Anything that could just be brought forth as a first reading, we did as a second reading. But then there were some that required some further counsel, some further questions, and, so it is a process within a process for sure. But then we turned over, a rock and found that there was more of a backlog, so.
Okay.
Is it possible to, and I don't know what the backlog looks like, and I don't know really how the policy committee works, but would it be an appropriate goal to say the policy committee would bring forth the backlog, like by the end of the calendar year? Like, could that be a goal, so we are caught up and ready for?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, again, I don't know what your
Yes.
meeting schedule
Yes.
is, but, I mean, I think that would be fair, that we were up to date by the end of December.
But the question still remains, how does the board want us to become up to date?
Right.
Like, what are you tasking us to do?
Well,
when
so
we sit
let's
down
just
with those
pick a
meetings?
potential number that there's 25. Okay, so there's 25 policies that,
Should be less than that.
I'll pick
Are we
any number.
thinking
They're-
like 15 though, like 12, 10, 5?
They keep rolling in.
Anybody got a number in the
Like
crowd?
approximately?
We're playing bingo up here. Let's say it's 9. If it's not, there's 9 policies left that will get us up to date. I think that before we can answer that, if out of those 9, you end up meeting every Monday, and you meet 3 Mondays in a row for an hour and you get through one, because you're not meeting every Monday, it's just hypothetical. If you can only get through one policy in 3 hours, well, then I would say that we have to come up with a different plan. We're never gonna be effective for the amount of policies that you have to review, especially if there was talk in the beginning of the school year of a full, policy book review, which is a lot. So could we use this first backlog amount as, basically like a test? We'd like them back to be voted on in the December meeting and see how much you have. Were they all rubber stamped? Were they simply small wording changes, abbreviation changes, something like that? Or were they all necessary to have more in-depth conversations to change them for this district?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that's been the process so far. So anything that Erie One recommends as far as changes, and we're okay with that, they've been on the agenda. Anything that we have discussed as a committee, and it's taken a little bit longer to flush through that, it's taken a little bit longer to get on the agenda. So that has been the process so far.
Okay.
To Elizabeth's point is, at what point, there's a policy on the agenda for a second reading tonight, and at what point would the board want to go deeper with something that's taking the policy committee a little bit deeper to go through?
Yeah, so I think speaking to that one specifically, I think that in my opinion, I would not expect the policy committee to try to make adjustments to anything that is a law or a mandated part of the policy. Because I think that, I think you're going down a rabbit hole with something like that. If there's a possibility of making it better for Red Creek within the means of the law or the regulation per the state, the federal government, whatever it is, I think that that's okay, but I think that if there if we're going that deep and trying to find loopholes, I think that would be more than, I'm not saying that's what happened, I'm just saying, I would say whatever that base policy is that starts with whatever mandate we're trying to fill, that stays together, that we keep that and we don't try to manipulate that. If there's parts of that are not mandated, I think that's the part where I would expect there would be some deeper conversation if you could change it, or if it would fit the school district better.
Well, I think that's part of the process too, is figuring out what does, who says it's mandated, who says it's law, and whether or not we can change any of the wording to fit the needs of our district.
Can the attorney
We don't-
share
Yeah, we don't need to.
what was mandated?
Yeah, we don't need
But
to-
that particular policy is
Kim,
not a
the
mandatory
attorney
policy.
indicated what was federal and state law. You have been given all of the information.
Okay, thank you.
So let's try to keep it to just the committee itself at this point. So, I think we could talk about this for a long time, trying to figure out what is going to, what is gonna fall under a mandate, what's not. I think that's the role of that committee. So, the time management piece of it and seeing what you can get through and trying to meet this deadline of the 31st of this year. We'll start that as the charter, maybe make an adjustment once we get to that point. You know, X amount of policies a month, X amount of policies a meeting, however we wanna do it. My only other suggestion is that we keep to the first and second reading of policies, especially now. I think about the fact that Mrs. Bliss isn't here tonight. That means that she would have had an opportunity to at least be involved in one conversation. Typically, we don't see board members out in 2 meetings in a row, so. Would that work for everybody? For the charter piece of this? Okay, all right, we're gonna move on. Dear students, it's not usually that long, so, sorry.
it is.
You're welcome. Okay, declaration of surplus property, F2, could I have a motion, please? Mrs. Kaiser in a second, Mrs. Folds. This is a fun list. Any questions on that? Maybe I just short an oven?
I mean, I didn't know we had an ice cream freezer, and that's pretty exciting, so.
I am super excited and I'm wondering
It's in
where
the
we're putting
old-
it.
It was in the old concession stand behind the soccer field.
I also did not know Mrs. Decker, so it's disappointing that I didn't. Any other questions? Okay, when you're ready.
Mrs. Kaiser,
Yes.
Mrs. Folds,
Yes.
Mrs. Decker,
Yes.
Mrs. Dingman,
Yes.
Mrs. Allen, and Mrs. Madigan.
Yes. Thank you. Okay, moving on, F3, this is gonna be the first reading for 8110, 8240, 8320, 8330, and 8340. Could I have a motion, please? Thank you, Mrs. Kaiser, and a second by Mrs. Decker. As this is just the first reading, obviously information back to the policy committee if there are any questions. Everybody had a chance to glance at these. Any clarifications we might need to give to the policy committee before it comes back? I just have one question for the policy committee. Would you have considered these, and I don't wanna steal your words, Mrs. Decker, but a rubber stamped kind of group? Were these a simple, not so simple?
Yeah, they're simple.
Mostly fill in the blank stuff, basically.
Okay, alright, great. Okay, if there are any questions, we'll move to table this for a second reading at the next board meeting. Thank you. Okay, I'll take a motion for number 4, the second reading and adoption of policy 7552. Can I have a motion, please, Mrs. Dingman? And a second, Mrs. Folds. Questions, comments?
So this is one that we had discussed as a policy committee and felt that it would be maybe better to bring it up to the whole board for the whole board's perspective on it, to see if we feel that it's meeting the needs of our district. This is not a mandatory policy. There are mandatory laws ingrained within the policy that whether we have a policy on this or not have to be followed by the district.
Elizabeth, please speak, this is not from the policy committee. Do not speak on
So this
behalf
is
of
me speaking.
Okay.
So that is my understanding, and, I personally feel that we could make changes to this to make it more, inclusive to everyone in our district. And I know it's a hot button topic, so, those are my thoughts on it. I think that the board needs to have a more in-depth discussion on this policy.
Can I ask a question about this?
Mhm.
Because I feel like we've been, I mean, this has been a topic of discussion dating as far back as our previous board.
Mhm.
If I'm understanding correctly, if we vote no on this, we lose state funding. Is that correct?
Untrue. This is not a mandatory policy, so that's something that we looked into. Matt might be able to speak on it more, but my understanding is that the laws that this policy is including, we have to follow as a district, but we don't have to have a policy on it necessarily. And I'm not saying that I don't think we should have a policy on it, I just think that it would be worth looking at and seeing if we can do better for the students in our district.
So can I just make a quick clarification? The policy being presented as a revision is the revision from Erie One and the school attorney, is that correct?
I don't know about the school attorney.
Not the
but
school attorney, just
Erie
your
One. These are the recommendations from Erie One.
Based off of New York State mandates?
Which,
Yes?
Based off of
Yes.
their interpretation of New York State mandates, yes.
which I guess leads me again to, if we are not following New York State mandates, do we lose funding?
We could be sued if we don't follow New York State mandates, that's what it comes down to. But I personally think that there are ways that we can follow the mandates and still, have more protection over our students.
Nancy, can you weigh in?
I'm sorry?
I just want you to weigh in because you're on the policy committee as well.
Yeah, our job is to protect the civil rights of all students. And there are attorneys that have weighed into this. I have shared, our attorneys has presented to other districts that I shared the videos with you. You know, whether or not you approve this policy, this board, the administrators, the district is required to comply with the law. And the law is very clear.
And for the record, I'm not suggesting that we take rights away from anybody. What I had proposed to the policy committee is that we look at our restroom, locker room situation and making them completely single stalls so that any student can go and change in any stall without having to identify either way to anybody. And then that eliminates the whole issue of people being uncomfortable in either direction, regardless of where you fall. That is what I think would cover all classes of students, any identification of students. I think that that could be a really inclusive way to still follow the laws. I understand that we have to follow the laws as a district.
Could I ask a question to that,
Yeah.
Mrs. Decker? So, just so that I understand, and I wanna say I appreciate if I'm remembering correctly, it was Mrs. Dingman that sent a copy of the policy where the pieces that were struck out and therefore the changes that were suggested. If I understand correctly, the changes that you're suggesting are not actually any changes that are being
Correct.
made to this policy. So
Yep.
you're actually suggesting that we change a policy that we currently have here at Red Creek.
Yes, what's being changed are the words government issued document or court issued document, also law. Also changed, this is not applicable to the records that cannot be accessed when modifying archived records is protected by law, also law. However, the district may need to use the student's legal name and gender in certain limited circumstances, also law. That's what's being changed, nothing else. Also,
So I guess my question is, if this is already a current policy that the district has,
yes,
the only thing that's changing is what is in blue.
Correct, and the red
So technically,
strikeout.
we're voting on blue right here.
Yes, and the red strikeout.
Well, we're
Okay.
voting on the whole policy.
But-
It's an existing policy, we're voting on these changes to the existing policy. And
So, question, because maybe I'm not understanding. You want to change the policy as a whole.
so when we were discussing it as the policy committee, we were kind of split on whether, if we have a policy in front of us and it could better serve our district, and I think if it were any policy aside from this one, I don't think that we would probably be having this in-depth of a discussion. But if there are ways that we can make it more accommodating to the district as a whole, should we make those changes while we're looking at other changes? Because once this policy is signed and we're done, or once this policy goes through and we're done with it, we potentially wouldn't get back to this for 4, 5 more years, depending on how quickly we're moving through policies.
Why is that? Because does there have to be a length of time before it can be
No,
revisited?
not necessarily,
or
but
just
I
because
just
there's
don't,
backlog?
I just don't know how quickly it would get brought back up, if it would ever get brought back up. So I feel like if we're making changes to a policy, we should. And there are other questionable changes that we should address them while we're looking at it, so we don't have to readdress the policy again.
So I have to say that I think that this, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I think that this is definitely something that we would need to discuss after this first round from the policy committee, the catch-up, because depending on who's on the policy committee at the time, making changes to existing policy outside of what's being recommended could prove to be relatively lengthy. So I think that's
that would be, every board would be different, so say
Things
for,
could- yeah.
say for example, you know, we approve this with the idea that the policy committee is gonna go back and revamp this whole thing and we're gonna visit it again. Say we approve the blue tonight, move on, the policy committee knows in their head, we're going back to this. We may not have the same policy committee next year, there could be different people on it, which then would
change the
kind of negate everything that we just thought was gonna happen.
Which I think is to Elizabeth's point that, like, should we not touch it twice? And it's not even just, not just this one, but any policy that we're looking at.
My own,
Doesn't meet the needs of our district at this present time while we're looking at it, while we're touching it.
I guess another question is, are we looking at this as a whole? Because I think every single one of us probably have very personal opinions on this. Are we looking at as a whole of what is the best route to go for our district, not necessarily our own personal children? I mean, obviously we all have kids in the district, but, I don't know, I just worry we're getting into a very sticky situation where we run the risk of getting sued.
I would have to say that I think that it is a little bit dangerous for us as board members to be too presumptuous with what we can change for some of these. I'm not saying that we don't have the right to question these policies, but in all reality, they should at least be seen every 3 years. That typically is the goal, that all policies are reviewed at least once every 3 years, if not more, because of changes or mandate changes or something like that. And I'm almost at it. I would be surprised that our district, for the pieces that are not being changed, are that dramatically different within the last 3 years.
So Stephanie, I would be curious if we asked our school lawyer. I would assume that there would not be any legal issue with creating single stall changing areas for all students from a legal perspective, but if that is the concern, then I would be curious what the lawyer thinks.
So I guess my
Yeah.
question is, and I personally like your idea, does that have to go through the policy, or could we as a district decide, well, if this is our policy, we wanna do single stall bathrooms. Does that have to be written into a policy, or can we as a district decide that?
I feel like policy is what the foundation of the district is built on. So if we don't have it in policy, I don't think there's anything holding us to do it as a district,
Right, so
or
there could be
any follow through on
procedure
that.
in place or a process in place, but what does that fall back on?
Yeah, but don't you see that as a micromanagement from the board level? I mean, there's lots of policies that we have in front of us that don't, say that Mr. Van Orman should meet with his admin team once a month or once a week, and, you know, I mean, some of this has to be at the discretion of the leadership of the district.
So I would counter that because this policy already gives guidance. It's just different guidance than what we're discussing right now. Like, it's already, if you're saying micromanaging, it's already micromanaging this policy.
This policy is following the law.
I understand that, but I'm saying we're making a change to what's already here. Like,
This policy is following the law.
I understand
You're
that.
asking to change this. Like
But
what?
the policy is not law, though. The policy is
State
including pieces of
education
law.
is very clear on what we need to do.
But I think that there can be, for lack of a better term, more than one way to skin a cat here.
Well, state education is very clear, and they've sent it out to all the districts.
I've never seen anything written in law saying you have to follow through on the law in this particular manner.
I guess
What I'm proposing, I don't feel like is outside of the confines of any of the law that I've read or any of the information that has been given to me. And I'm,
Yes, okay, I just don't understand why, if we wanna say we're protecting the rights of all students, and we go ahead and approve this, I don't understand why, if the administration of the district so chose to go that, in this direction, why would it have to be written that Red Creek District is now going to all single stalls in the locker room, or like, why?
Well, I think one point within the policy that talks about specifically the restrooms and locker rooms is probably a sticking point. I mean, obviously you mentioned personal versus what's good for the district, but I do see it in that perspective, that being, you could look at it from that side as well, if you're looking at all district and what's the best way to move forward. I guess what I'm getting stuck on is, I understand the theory of not wanting to touch a policy twice. I understand that, but I think we're going to be better served with looking at the changes. This policy is already in place, looking at the changes, voting on the changes as is, and then I think we need to have another discussion as a board about this specific policy. I don't think that discussion necessarily needs to be tonight, but I do think if this is a policy that's already in place, then we should be looking at the changes to that and then having another discussion.
Because I think what a lot of us are stuck on is not what we're actually voting on tonight
I
with the
agree.
changes.
I agree with you.
Well, if that were the case, there would be, there would need to be a new motion made for a revision to a policy, not what's in front of you. So when this discussion is over, the vote will be, unless it changes, will be on what is presented in front of you now with the new blue additions and the strikeout in red.
Which is just strictly the blue and red. It has nothing to do with anything that is in black at this point.
That is correct.
The thought is in that paragraph, the very first sentence, the district will allow transgender or GNC student to use restrooms and locker rooms that corresponds to the student's consistently expressed gender identity.
Wait, where?
It's
It's
the
just under
restrooms and locker rooms paragraph. The idea is to change the wording so that the district will allow any student, not to name the specific preference of a student, but rather the district will allow any student to use the restroom or locker room that corresponds, so that it's not specifically outlining who may be comfortable or uncomfortable.
I can only imagine that these policies, these laws must be written as generically as possible for everyone to fall underneath them. If that is such a, like, why wasn't that in the original policy? If it's such a minute,
Yeah, I don't know.
minor thing.
That's a great question.
I mean, I have to say to that, and I understand that the policy is a guideline for us, but when I look out at this group, I can't imagine that the way that we're enforcing this is specific to any student. Because we have plenty of policies that, that bring up the fair and equitable treatment of our students.
It says any student requesting increased privacy, any student,
She's talking about the first line, Nancy.
yeah.
She wants the transgender GNC student piece removed.
No, it's the
And I
law.
guess also
That's the law.
bringing up single stalls, if there's a transitioning student or a student who might want to transition and does not want to openly say it, doesn't want to get picked on, doesn't want to go into the other changing room, it would also give them the opportunity to, without having to say anything, without having to identify to other students, it would give them the ability to have that privacy.
And don't we
That's
have
about-
Any
areas
student
now
can
that are
do that
gender
now.
neutral where a student, if they so choose, could go to?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna lay out some examples here. So if there is a transgender student who is choosing to use the female locker room, and there's females in the locker room that are uncomfortable, there is an opportunity for them to use another space,
If
correct?
they ask permission, and I think it's one area, one bathroom in the hallway.
But it is
outside.
an option.
Mhm.
Okay, so if the transgender student decides, I don't wanna go to the locker room and I wanna go to the gender neutral, they have that option also.
Mhm.
Okay, so if there is, and I don't know how many kids are in a gym class, but say there's 30 kids in a gym class and one transgender student wants to use the girls' locker room, I'm just saying girls as an example, but, and then the 29 other students wanna use the single stall bathroom because they then feel uncomfortable. That's an option.
That's correct.
Now, it would be very time consuming and it would be inconvenient.
And I think from a psychological perspective, in a way that's almost ostracizing more to,
That is your
That's
opinion.
I would agree,
That-
but again, that's a personal opinion.
it
I'm
is-
just, my concern is if we are strictly voting on the blue and the red today, and the black is already a policy. I don't know.
Okay. Are there other comments? Okay, I'm gonna ask for a vote then, please.
Mrs. Kaiser?
I'm gonna say on strictly red and blue changes only, I will vote yes. I
Mrs.
do think this needs to be amended.
You just get a vote. Dot, dot, dot.
Voting yes because I'm concerned about losing any type of school funding or getting sued.
Mrs. Foltz?
I'm voting yes with caveat to look at this for amendment.
Mrs. Dingman?
Yes.
Mrs. Decker?
no.
Mrs. Allen?
No.
Mrs. Madigan?
Yes. Okay, moving
Can
on.
I request that we add this relatively soon to be, like, people can go home and think about it and mull over what they would like to see and not have this sit for 2 years?
I don't think it needs to sit for 2 years, but the current situation is for the policy committee to go over the backlog, so I would say when that's completed, there would be an option to go back over.
So
But I
if-
feel like the policy committee is done with this, we're not gonna make any more changes or recommendations. So I guess what I'm asking is, can the board look at this and have a discussion again in a month, maybe 2 months, to come to some sort of an agreement so it doesn't sit? It's not gonna come back through policy committee, 'cause
Yeah, well, I would say the board has come to an agreement, it's passed, So what kind of agreement are you looking for? Because I don't think I understand.
So, obviously Kim and I voted no, and both the Stephanies said that they would like to see other changes. So I think that it needs to have a discussion for what people would like to see as those changes.
I think reviewed, is that correct? Not necessarily changed, is that?
Reviewed.
I've been asking for an audit committee for 2 years.
I would say
That's why I didn't
reviewed
want to pass it and then have it sit for
with
2
the
years.
idea that a change is possible.
So I think that if this wanted to, I think it would be really difficult to just have an open forum discussion like this about a policy without more detailed legal
I was
information.
gonna say, I feel like I'd like lawyer
Yes.
So I guess-
support with it. I would like to see lawyer, maybe recommendations on how to appropriately.
I'm gonna change that a little bit if you would agree to it, but I would say for the 2 people that voted no, the changes that you're suggesting, I would suggest that you pass them to the superintendent and we could get legal advice on if they're actually possible.
We have already run them by the superintendent. I don't know if you found anything out from our discussions, but
Right, the response that I got from the lawyers were to, that what was reflected in the policy is presently required under New York state law.
I wish you would have said that, half an hour ago.
but she also said the policy as a whole is not required by law. Like this is not a mandatory policy is what you told us.
That is listed correct, even under Erie 1.
So I guess I'm confused. I mean, obviously the discussion's over, but I guess I'm confused. It's a law or it's not. I don't know how it's both.
You have to comply with the requirements, but you're not required to have a policy.
So they still have to do this, even if it's not in writing.
But a
what she's
policy
saying.
allows the folks that work here to have guidance. Make sense? All right, let's talk about my next favorite subject.
So I will say this though, I don't think that we've given any real direction to that though. If there's no changes that can be made, I'm struggling with how we handle this.
We can, your suggestion's good, we'll go back to the superintendent and have a conversation. 'Cause
As a
there's
policy
M-
committee as a
there's M-
whole,
No, the 2 people that voted no for the policy to go.
so as the policy committee as a whole,
Yeah, I would suggest that you do
Yes,
this.
that's fine, yeah, that's fine.
Because then there's, you're meeting as a group. So however you wanna tack that on, if you wanna do it behind the rest of the first reading and whatever's left over, whatever random number that we came up before, if there's an opportunity to get some clarification on what could potentially be changed,
Sure.
if there is, that could be presented back to the board. And Elizabeth, I'm not trying to, not listen to your suggestion. I just think without a little bit more information, some of us would be more confused on what potentially could be changed. Okay, moving on. F5, I take a motion for discussion on this, please. Thank you, Mrs. Kaiser, and a second by Mrs. Folds. All right, so, this is on here kind of because of me, so before we all start firing. This is for discussion purposes only. 7132, if you haven't read it yet, is the policy that's concerning tuition paying students that live outside the district that could attend Red Creek. I'd like to have a discussion on this because after talking to Mr. Van Orman, which he has some enrollment numbers for us, which are on the decline. I don't think it's just specific to Red Creek. This policy in particular has changed a number of times while in my time on the board. And knowing that the numbers are dropping, knowing that there are, I believe probably everyone at this table has been asked or questioned about the opportunity if the board would be willing to discuss it. I just wanted to have a general conversation. So anyone have any thoughts?
I have questions.
Yes,
Do
ma'am.
those count? Okay. So is this something that, and Matt, I don't know if you know this, but do you know what, like, do you have numbers in your head of what it would cost to have additional students for the district versus the tuition, and would, I don't know mean, median, and mode. Like, if it's a lower need student, I would assume that their cost would be lower. If it's a higher need student, their cost would be higher. Do you have any idea of what that would look like?
So we have a per pupil cost, which is for a 712 student, $5,564 a year, $5,564 a year. So that's the average cost that we would be looking at. In terms of identifying different level costs based on the level of need of a student, that is not legal.
Okay. Do we, so I know we get some state reimbursement for higher need students. Does that count if they're out of district students?
So if there was an out-of-district student, if there was a policy that allowed out-of-district students on a tuition basis to come into the school, they basically become a Red Creek student in all of our attendance counts. So like our lunch counts, our beds counts, all of those things would serve as if the student resided in Red Creek schools, district boundaries.
Okay.
It's the same.
Mrs. Decker, do you have more or no?
I do, but I was giving other people a chance
Okay.
to jump in.
Anyone else have any questions, comments?
When I read through this policy, I was a little bit confused. It was last revised in 18, but the grandfather clause says that any non-resident student enrolled as of June 1st, 2012. So I didn't, like, I guess I'm having trouble understanding like where this policy leaves off. Like, what is the current?
So we currently do not accept students on tuition, but when that was changed, we still had students in district, well, out of district that were paying tuition to be here.
Okay.
But the board at that time had decided that we would no longer be accepting any more. So there needed to be that grandfather clause in order to have those students finish their education here, and then there wouldn't be any new.
Okay. So how did this topic come to be? Like, why are we reviewing this right now?
Well,
What is the context?
So what I had just said about the enrollment numbers
Yep.
being lower, it seems to be a regular topic of conversation. I had discussed with another board member about, if this continues in this trend, do we have an idea of what direction that we want to go? If there's, if we don't have as much need for teachers, are we cutting positions, things like that? I think that's why this policy has swung back and forth through time. Also, different board members, so there was obviously at one time, they felt there was a need to accept students outside of the district on a tuition basis,
Sure.
so.
Do we have a sense of with the rate of requests or how many students typically would we be looking at in a typical year where we would be requesting?
Maybe historically, what did that look like?
Yeah, so it's been quite a while. I know just on two fronts. One, during some of our hiring process, the topic of non-resident students came up a lot with potential employees of ours as a question. And then I could count probably on two hands this year community member requests, or I guess maybe not specific community members, about do we accept students from as a non-district resident, because they were looking, they'd been looking for housing in the Red Creek area. It's difficult. It's obviously a tough housing market right now. They were, unsuccessful in finding suitable housing for them, but still wanted to provide the Red Creek education for their children. So I'm getting it. I've been receiving it on two fronts. Questions, I guess.
So would we have to cap it? Like, would we be able, what would that look like?
You mean
I'm
like for
assuming
number of students?
Yes, I'm assuming we couldn't take 300 students on. That would be too much. So is it like first come, first serve, or if kids sign up, are they going to give preference the next year? Will staff be
Can we
free?
cap it?
Right, will, staff members, kids, if they wanna bring them into district, are they free? I know that was a benefit that some districts have, is they can bring their kids with them for free.
Right. So I think all of that would, go into the discussion, obviously.
There can't be a cap though necessarily, right? Wouldn't that be like a form of discrimination or something?
I'm not certain on that.
Okay.
I
I mean,
didn't look
I'm guessing
into
we're
the
not getting
potential
300
of a
kids,
cap.
but you never know.
Right.
The school's really great.
It is really great.
What is the reason that we stopped taking tuition for non-district?
Well, I think there's probably a couple, right? So as we talked about just a minute ago, like that 55-64 number is kind of the cap of what we could legally charge per student at that level. To if you want to just tick up the
She's going right now.
Yeah, that's different.
that's the cap that we would be able to charge per pupil.
Would that cap meet the cost that it would cost the district for the pupil? I'm assuming no. No?
Not necessarily. So, I'm sure at one point, some of the discussion was regarding the amount of taxpayer dollars going towards not tax-paying children, families, children, if that makes sense. And again, in terms of that number, if we cannot discriminate about the student that we would accept in on that. So depending on the level of need of that student would have, the district would bear the burden of the cost associated with that student. Which could be, in excess of $100,000 annually.
I thought that it should be at least a consideration because we don't really have any control over students that necessarily just move into our district and the cost of their needs.
That's true.
So,
But there are students and they're tax-paying students, so.
yeah, my only thought to that is that, I could only consider, I don't remember what we charged, tuition for the students that were grandfathered in the last time, but, I do know how much we charged like a foreign exchange student to attend here, and if it was based around that, just a thought, it's much more than I would say most people pay for taxes in a year here.
I was thinking that it's
Yeah.
more than a tax.
So, correct me if I'm wrong though, but, okay, I think that you answered this already, but if they were a student that was going to cost more like $100,000, there's some federal, state funding to help offset that?
Yeah, so again,
Still?
any public student here, so you're probably talking about students that would have IEPs. And we have high cost aid that we would receive back on some of those. There are thresholds for those. And these, any student, again, whether they were a non-resident tuition paying student or somebody who lives in the district, we get the same funding return on those as well through BOCES.
So, this was just meant for a discussion. You have something to say?
Yeah, is everybody done with their questions?
I hope, can we see the numbers? Can you forward those, like what the enrollment was?
Oh, so I just did a quick snapshot. Where is it? Here it is. So this current year, as of, I don't know, a couple days ago at this point, we're at 800 district students for this year. And in comparison at the same date last year, we were at 859. So just I did not go further back. That might be a little more aggressive than what we've seen in the last few years, but I would agree that the trend has been in in that direction.
We also have population decline and.
Sure,
Right,
right.
there.
Yep.
Kids are
Could we
expensive.
also know, what the numbers were of tuition paying students? Obviously not right now, but that might just be worthy of seeing.
For like, for how long?
Whatever you'd like to give us, I guess, so maybe, I don't know what would be appropriate to ask for in that regard, I guess.
I think my 9 years on the board, there were 5
Yeah.
total.
5 total students or 5 years?
5 total
5 total.
students in
Oh.
9 years.
Okay. Okay.
The
Never mind.
grandfathering piece was the last 2 students, and, I mean, the number was very low, I
Okay.
guess.
Thank you.
It will be interesting to see, sorry, Jolene keeps texting, she's watching, to see what happens with enrollment in the next few years with our COVID kids that are coming up with population. But I would like to see the breakdown to see the difference from UPK through 6, because as you know, you shared the 5,000, but the amount that you can charge a family due to the formula is for K through 6 is 0. So if you allow the.
And I said 712.
I know you did, but just informing the
Wait, so
board.
we can't
So
charge
informing-
tuition for K-6?
It's a formula through the state, and it changes each year. So this year he said 55.64, next year it could be 55.85. So it depends on your approved operating expenses. Bill, I'm sure, could talk about that tomorrow all day to you if you'd like. But, so for for K through 6, if you allow non-residents, you can't charge a family anything. So what you're doing is, you're opening up the floodgates, and you're gonna say, come one, come all. And wouldn't it be nice to have smaller class sizes for our residents, for our kids?
I guess I'm confused, why
Because,
can't you charge tuition for K through 6?
because the state sets the rate.
Yeah.
And the rate is 0.
And the rate is 0 because it all depends on how much state aid you get and your operating expenses.
Yep.
Changes every year, okay?
So
First,
does it change from 0
First,
every
it
year?
starts out with an estimated rate, and so the estimated rate last year was $455. So you're
That you
gonna
could
say,
charge.
hey parent,
K6.
I'm gonna charge you $455, and then towards the middle of the year, the actual rate comes out, oh, nope, it's not gonna be $455, it's 0, here's your check back. All right, so you can't do
So
it.
technically, any student K through 6 can go really to school anywhere they want?
No, well, if you accept non-residents, you're gonna say, yes, you can come here. So you could have a student come in, and they could be a high-cost kid. They could cost $150,000. And the amount that you're gonna be on the hook for is the first $46,857 is the district's responsibility.
46,000, is that what you said?
The first $46,000 is the district's responsibility, and then you get
Aid on the
aid
difference.
on it, but you only get 76%. So take a $100,000 kid, which happens a lot, doesn't it, Julia?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. So you're gonna take this non-resident student, because we have low enrollment and you can't discriminate, and they're gonna cost you $59,000. And, sorry, I'm looking at it to say, for the amount of tuition that you're gonna charge of the $55.64, for what? What are you gonna get out of $55,000 or $55,500?
$5,500.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's been a long day. Like, what program are you gonna add with that much money for our kids? But your exposure is greater.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't get it. You're expanding your class sizes, you're exposing yourself to discipline, behavior. Is somebody gonna say, hey, are you now recruiting for sports? Yep, happened at another district. That's why they did away with it. So what's your value add for allowing non-residents to come?
So what would you say to, let's just say roughly that this decline continues?
It's happening all throughout New York State.
Right, so let's just say that it does stay on that
Mhm.
same trend. And in 2 years, we're removing someone's position that's sitting in this room, or a teacher in kindergarten, or is it, and I'm asking you because you rated, you know, what you're getting for exposure versus exposure. Is it worth it to you to take the risk of potential decline in staff as opposed to taking the risk of opening the
But are you gonna
floodgates?
be able to get 12 people to make up for that?
I'm not sure.
In
the
each,
answer.
are you gonna be able to get 12 kindergartners to come in to make up for
I'm not
that?
saying that you could, you can. I'm just asking you when you're
And then have it be
comparing the risks.
consistent.
You know what I mean? Do you think that the risk is better taken and hoping that there will be something else to change, enrollment or class sizes or people, you know, more housing availability or something like that, versus this
Or
other option?
instead of having 3, or instead of having 4 kindergarten classrooms, you go down to 3, and there's still gonna be class sizes of 12 and 13 due to lower enrollment.
Right, well, that's what I mean. So, but then
Right.
that
But
fourth
it's
teacher.
through
The fourth
attrition
teacher
though.
needs a job.
Right, because people are retiring.
But even if we have these students in kindergarten coming in and we have enough to keep that fourth kindergarten teacher, that's fully on the district to pay that kindergarten teacher for those kids because we're not getting any money back for those kindergarten kids. Correct? Am I understanding?
I'm sorry, what?
Like, we charge 0 for tuition for those kindergarten kids, so we're not getting any money.
Non-resident.
Correct.
Okay,
So if we
yeah,
let in 12 kindergarten kids from out of district, they're paying us $0, and then we still have to keep this fourth position that the district fully has to pay for.
You will then get a foundation aid while that lasts. Right now, who knows?
But there's no guarantee that we're going to get any dollars to pay that extra teacher.
You'll get the first $13,000 with foundation aid while that formula lasts.
While it lasts.
Right now.
So the reason I asked that, I didn't mean to use
Because
an
you'll get
elementary
enrollment.
teacher, because let's just say that it's potentially an AP course in the high school. So, you know, we need to eliminate that, it's not a mandate for graduation, so we have to reduce headcount in the high school. Again, I'm not looking for a vote or any sort of motion, I just thought that it's come up a lot, it's been reviewed oftentimes in the past. And I thought that it might be worth a discussion, especially for those members that are less familiar with the policy, and if you want to take a look at it. So,
But a teacher is roughly $100,000, so you're not gonna get, you're not gonna have, the students aren't gonna make it up, your non-residents aren't gonna make up the difference.
I can see your point.
It's about us.
So I guess what I would say is if there's anyone that wants to discuss this further or is considering wanting to make a change to this policy to allow out-of-district students on a tuition basis, let me know, and we can add it back to an agenda. If not, we're gonna move on, okay? All right, perfect, thank you. Okay, so F6, I'll take a motion for the 23 district safety plan, please. Mrs. Folds, in a second. Mrs. Kaiser. From my understanding, there was a recent update from Mrs. Osborne for this, correct? You make sure that you're pulling up the most recent version. So we all have the same numbering scheme. Haha. Any questions on this?
Are we actually voting on this tonight?
We are?
Yes.
Okay, so in it says that this has to be made public for 30 days before the board votes on it.
It's been, it's been,
I looked online and I haven't seen it. Where has it been?
It started,
August 2nd.
yeah,
Where?
at a board meeting.
It's published within the,
But were the changes, I guess what I'm asking, because there are changes that are new for us this time? Were those published for the public?
the names were updated. I think it's the actual,
The member names, right?
yeah, but I think the plan is the part that needs to be public for 30 days. Correct me if I'm wrong. Not the members. The
Right,
members
the-
could be
the
changed, but
district- The district plan is the public.
Right, so if, as long as it says that there's a board member on there, not necessarily who it
Correct.
is, then it's still been published for 30
Yeah.
days
Right.
or more.
And then the last addendum at the end is the district remote plan in consultation with our district safety officer, Jack McKeel from BOCES. That is in the law, that the remote plan is required to be in your district safety plan now. So that has been added in.
Any other questions?
I do, I'm sorry, I'm trying to open up what.
I think it's
So
printed
the
also.
email that Amanda sent out, that's on email, not on the board docs, because it's different. On page 9, because that one's colored for me. It's different on board docs.
Can you tell me what the page starts with?
I'm going.
Is it responses to acts of violence?
No, simple.
But
It
it's
says
not
in
page
the-
9?
It's in the event of an emergency.
Okay, so it's page 8 on the paper copy.
For me, it's 9, but it could be 8 for you.
Okay. 8 paper copy, 9 electronic copy.
Situational responses?
Yes. Go ahead.
It says, the district will utilize school tool to contact parents, guardians. Well, wouldn't they utilize Parent Square?
Parent Square,
So that should be changed.
yeah.
And then,
Good catch.
and the remote plan, Jack. Is this a template then from BOCES?
It is.
Okay, then you need to update the, you don't use Google, Teams, and Microsoft.
We do support all of those.
You have licenses to all 3?
I believe so.
All 3.
Yes,
You pay for all 3.
yes.
So any other questions on what
You
Mr.
are
Norman paid
wasting
for?
money. All right, and then at the end, you have a typo, page my 15, 4.
What's the
In
start with?
addition, Parent Square for mass communication.
Are you in the regular one?
In the
Or
red.
the,
It's on technically my last page.
Oh, okay, yeah.
oh,
Last page, is-
of the red.
yeah, last full.
Nancy, if you ever consider going
What
to
are we saying?
editing,
There's an extra F in the word for.
Oh,
it's Red Creek lingo. Any other questions?
That's it.
Okay, when you're ready.
They're gonna have to amend their,
And for
with the
fourth.
changes.
And the school tool to Parent Square.
School to Parent Square.
I think we should leave fourth in there.
I do not.
Mrs. Foltz, could I ask you to change your motion for the changes from school tool to Parent Square and removing the extra F? I'd like it in the minutes like that, if you don't mind. Mrs. Kaiser, would you second that?
Sure.
Okay, great. I don't think there's any other questions whenever you're ready.
Mrs. Decker?
Yes.
Mrs. Dingman?
Yes.
Mrs. Kaiser?
Yes.
Mrs. Allen?
Yes.
Mrs. Foltz?
Yes.
Mrs. Madigan?
Yes. Thank you. Okay, moving on. Number F7, capital project seeker. Could I have a motion? Mrs. Allen, thank you. In a second. Mrs. Kaiser?
It's, could you, what changed? I don't,
There was a date typo
that's it, okay.
On page 1.
on page 1.
Thank you.
So this is just the formal, we've been over this a
Just
couple of
went
times
from
now.
There was from the lawyer, had the wrong date.
Any questions, clarifications on this before
Oh, we already made the motion.
we, thank you, Mrs. Dingman. Okay, when you're ready.
Mrs. Foltz?
Yes.
Mrs. Allen?
Yes.
Mrs. Kaiser?
Yes.
Mrs. Dingman?
Yes.
Mrs. Decker?
Yes.
Mrs. Madigan?
Yes. Thank you. Okay, F8, capital project resolution, could I have a motion, please? Thank you, Mrs. Dingman, and a second. Mrs. Decker? Questions? When you're ready.
This is also a date change.
This one's correct.
No, there's an asterisk next to it. What was the change for this one?
There was, it said 7 PM instead of 6:30 PM when we first got it.
Thanks.
Mrs. Allen,
Yes.
Mrs. Dingman,
Yes.
Mrs. Decker,
Yes.
Mrs. Foltz,
Yes.
Mrs. Kaiser,
Yes.
Mrs. Madigan.
Yes. Thank you. Okay, F9, the 23-24 Wright Creek School Physician. Mrs. Dingman, thank you for the motion, and a second. Mrs. Folds? Discussion?
I would like to ask the question I asked earlier.
Oh, you had a question earlier?
I did, right? Why did we table the medical director for after? Is it typical that those two decisions are not made simultaneously at the same?
No, that is not typical. They should have been made at the same time. They are typically made at the same time.
Okay. Is it something we just missed, or, okay.
Other questions?
I appreciate, I know there were some things that were asked about, the conflict of interest here, so I appreciate that. I'm not sure if we're okay moving forward then with that explanation.
I don't know how much of the emails went out, but I'm happy to explain further if anyone wants me to, but I feel that there could be potentially a conflict of interest.
Is that the end of
Yeah, that's the end of my thought,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Any other questions? When you're ready.
Okay. Mrs. Kaiser,
Yes.
Mrs. Foltz,
Yes.
Mrs. Decker,
Sorry, no.
Mrs. Dingman,
Yes.
Mrs. Allen,
Yes.
Mrs. Madigan.
Yes. Thank you. Any questions, thoughts on the administrative reports? Okay, we're gonna move on. I thought those were reversed, but, Mr. Van Orman, did you have anything else?
I do not.
Okay. The only additional item that I have is, we had talked about a training time for the board. The two dates that I have right now from NISBA are October 14th and October 21st. Those would be mornings on a Saturday. I don't need anything concrete right now, but I just ask that if you check your calendar and tell me what's your number one pick, what's your number two pick, unless
You said October.
14th and October 21st. I would just state that the following Saturday is an option as well, but Ms. Osborne sent out a invitation to the annual NISBA conference that it falls in that week. From what I understand, that no one replied. Is anyone interested in attending that conference? Whoa, slow down. Alrighty, so if no one is interested in attending that conference, the following Saturday would be an option as well, if we can't seem to come to some sort of.
And what is the time we're looking at? I know you said morning, but.
So we're looking at like an 8 a.m. start,
To.
noon. We're looking at like a 10 a.m. start. Just got a lot of feedback from the right table. It's really a 4-hour slot. If we didn't want to do 8 a.m., I just picked 8 a.m. because then everybody has the whole rest of the day. If it doesn't work, let me know. We can adjust it a little bit. I went over some of the ideas that we had talked about that we'd like to work on. I also, we mentioned board goals. In prior conversations, we could talk about the process of that. Obviously, board goal setting needs to be done in public, so we could adjust that training to say 3 hours or 3.5 hours, include the process, and then have a public meeting for the last 30 minutes to an hour, and that would give us the ability to actually put the goals into place. But that doesn't need to be decided today, we just really need to pick a date, and what would work. I did also suggest that, I know there was some mixed feelings on some of the past facilitators, so they're gonna give us some options on facilitators as well.
So October, by the time we have goals, we'll be 1/3 into the school year.
My reverse button doesn't work very well. We could do it ahead
Yeah.
of time if we want to.
I would agree with that as well. I actually had the same thought that Nancy just had, that maybe that's a little bit too late. Maybe we should try to have that meeting, unfortunately, as a separate meeting.
Have the board goals as a separate meeting. I think that is completely fine, but that would need to be a separate meeting completely, because I think that our next meeting, if correct, would be October 18th.
October 7th.
I would say I think.
Okay, never mind.
October 7th is the same.
4th.
October 4th.
Sure.
Whatever the first-ish Wednesday is.
Matt just wants to hang out with us on the weekends.
October
And we all show up.
October 4th.
So the other option is also to meet early on, before the 4th. Could you help me interpret your noise? Is that not
I'm
a
just presenting on the 4th. Yeah, that's fine. It's okay. It's a great day. It's a great day.
Perfect. All right, would everybody be willing to make that adjustment to their schedule to come in, let's say, an hour early on the 4th? Is that
Still
possible?
5:30. I mean, I'm gonna have to look at a calendar.
Okay, so check the 14th and the 21st, and then see if 5:30 on the 4th is an option. If not, we might need to do a different evening or a morning and after 8 a.m. morning on the weekend or something to try to get those hammered out.
8 a.m. is fine if the cafe provides coffee.
Yeah, does anybody have connections to that place? It's a hot mess. Okay, so get back to me on those two dates, please, so we can move forward with that. The next board meeting is right on this thing. Huh?
The 4th.
Is the next board meeting?
Oh, okay.
The 14th or the 21st?
Okay.
Oh, it's 8:20. Anything else? Okay, I would take a motion to move into executive for a particular personnel matter. Mrs. Kaiser, and a second? Thank you, Mrs. Dingman. Oh, just one left, Mr. Gibbons. You made it the whole time. I feel like that should be extra credit. Yeah, good for you. You come every time we have a meeting if you'd like.